Tantor Audio presents A Great and Terrible King, Edward I and the Forging of Britain, by Marc Morris, narrated by Ralph Lister. Countries are not laid up in heaven. They are shaped and reshaped here on earth by the stratagems of men and the victories of the fortuitous. R. R. Davies, The First English Empire, 2000. Like Alexander, he would speedily subdue the whole world if fortune's moving wheel would stand still forever. The Song of Lewis on Edward I, 1264. Preface. On learning that I was writing a book about Edward I, my non-historian friends and neighbours have asked me almost invariably the same two questions. Was he Edward the Confessor? Has been by far the most common. No, I would always answer, he was not. But he was named after him. In many cases, this only served to provoke a subsidiary, more vexed inquiry. If my subject was named after one of his forebears, then how on earth could he possibly be the first? The answer, of course, is that he couldn't, and that, strictly speaking, he wasn't. For those who would care to know precisely how this confusing situation came about, I have added a short note of explanation at the end of this preface. The second question that has usually been put to me concerns the nature of the evidence for writing the biography of a medieval king, and specifically its quantity. In general, people tend to presume that there can't be very much, and imagine that I must spend my days poking around in castle muniment rooms, looking for previously undiscovered scraps of parchment. Sadly, they are mistaken. The answer I always give to the question of how much evidence is more than one person could look at in a lifetime. From the early 12th century, the kings of England began to keep written accounts of their annual expenditure, and by the end of the century they were keeping a written record of almost every aspect of royal government. Each time a royal document was issued, be it a grand charter or a routine writ, a copy was dutifully entered onto a large parchment roll. Meanwhile, in the provinces, the king's justices kept similar rolls to record the proceedings of the cases that came before his courts. Miraculously, the great majority of these documents have survived, and are now preserved in the National Archives at Kew, near London. Some of them, when unrolled, extend to 20 or 30 feet. And their number is legion. For the 13th century alone, it runs to tens of thousands. Mercifully for the medieval historian, the most important have been transcribed and published, but even this printed matter would be enough to line the walls of an average-sized front room with books. Moreover, the quantity is increased by the inclusion of non-royal material. Others beside the king were keeping records during Edward I's day. Noblemen also drew up financial accounts, issued charters, and wrote letters. Monks did the same, only in their case the chances of such material surviving was much improved by their membership of an institution. Monks, in addition, continued to do as they had always done, and kept chronicles, and these too provide plenty to keep the historian busy. To take just the most obvious example from the 13th century, the monk of St. Albans called Matthew Paris composed a chronicle, the original parts of which cover the quarter century from 1234 to 1259. In its modern edition, it runs to 7 volumes. I say all this merely to demonstrate how much there is to know about our medieval ancestors, and not to pretend that I have in some way managed to scale this mountain all by myself. For the most part, I have not even had to approach the mountain at all, for this book is grounded on the scholarly work of others. Nevertheless, even the secondary material for a study of Edward I presents a daunting prospect. At a conservative estimate, well over 1,000 books and articles have been published in the last 100 years that deal with one aspect or another of the king's reign. For scholarly works on the 13th century as a whole, that figure would have to be multiplied many times over. By this stage, anyone who had quizzed me about the making of this book, assuming they were still listening, must have had a third question forming in their minds, though they were all too polite to pose it. That question, I imagine, was, why bother? Why devote a sizable chunk of one's own life to re-examining the deeds of a man who has been dead for 7 centuries? The answer, as I hope the finished product will make clear, is that the reign of Edward I matters. Not for nothing did I settle on a subtitle that includes the phrase, "The Forging of Britain." This period was one of the most pivotal in the whole of British history, a moment when the destinies of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland were decided. It was also one of the most dramatic. Edward summoned the biggest armies and the largest parliaments seen in Britain during the Middle Ages. He built the greatest chain of castles in Europe. He expelled the Jews, conquered the Welsh, and very nearly succeeded in conquering the Scots. We are often told these days that we ought to have a greater sense of what it means to be British. I hope that this book goes some small way towards fulfilling that need. Naturally, this is not the first attempt to broach the subject, nor, I predict, will it be the last. In the 20th century, Edward I was examined at length by 2 eminent medieval historians, Maurice Powick and Michael Prestwich. As the notes at the end of this book make clear, my debt to both is very great. During several years of writing and research, I have turned to their books constantly and repeatedly, and have always been struck by insights that would not have occurred to me from the original evidence. And even when I have looked at the evidence and reached different conclusions, their work has always provided me with an invaluable starting point. The main way in which my work differs from theirs is in its construction. Both Powick and Prestwich chose to approach Edward thematically, devoting whole chapters to his lawmaking, his diplomacy, and so on. I have opted for a chronological treatment, which gives the following pages some claim to originality. No one has attempted to tell Edward's story from beginning to end since before the First World War, which effectively means that no one has told his story in this way since the invention of medieval history as a modern academic discipline. Of course, such a chronological approach has certain inherent drawbacks. Some academic readers may be disappointed that there is not more here on Edward's statutes or his governmental inquiries. I can only offer the excuse that the discussion of such topics would have been hard to incorporate into an already complicated narrative without the whole thing grinding to a halt, and that in any case, these topics have been well covered elsewhere. I also take some comfort from recent research which suggests that the English Justinian probably had no hand, and perhaps little interest, in drawing up the laws that were issued in his name. On a more positive note, the task of putting the events of Edward's life in their correct order has led me to question existing orthodoxies more frequently than I had imagined might be necessary. I hope that the new interpretations I have offered in their place will be found convincing, or at least stimulating, by other medievalists. Edward I, or Edward IV. Before the reign of the king we call Edward I, England had been ruled by several other kings who shared his name. The trouble was that even from a 13th century standpoint, they had all lived a very long time in the past. At the time of Edward's accession in 1272, even his most recent royal namesake, Edward the Confessor, had been dead for more than 2 centuries. Everyone in the 13th century remembered the Confessor, for by then he had become the patron saint of the English royal family. But when it came to the other King Edwards, people were altogether more hazy. Towards the end of Edward I's reign, for example, some of his subjects felt compelled to chronicle his remarkable deeds, and decided that they needed to distinguish the king by giving him a number. Unfortunately, they miscounted, including in their tallies the Confessor, who ruled from 1042 to 1066, and also the celebrated 10th century king Edward the Elder, 899 to 924, but overlooking entirely the short and unmemorable reign of Edward the Martyr, 975 to 978. For this reason, at least 2 13th century writers referred to Edward I as Edward III. Had they counted correctly, they would have called him Edward IV. Fortunately for us, such early and inaccurate numbering schemes did not endure. In general, when his contemporaries wished to distinguish Edward, they called him King Edward, son of King Henry. The need for numbers arose only after his death, when he was succeeded by a son and then a grandson, both of whom bore his illustrious name. By the middle of the 14th century, Englishmen found themselves having to differentiate between 3 consecutive, identically named kings, and so, unsurprisingly, they started referring to them as the first, second, and third. Anyone troubled by the recollection that once upon a time there had been other kings called Edward could salve their historical conscience by adding, since the conquest. Thus the Norman conquest became the official starting point for the numbering of English kings. But it was only necessary to have such a starting point in the first place because of Henry III's idiosyncratic decision to resurrect the name of a long-dead Anglo-Saxon royal saint and bestow it on his eldest son. A note on money. For those readers who, like me, were born after the English currency was decimalised, it is worth pointing out that sterling used to be measured in pounds, shillings, and pence. 12 pennies made a shilling, and 20 shillings made a pound. This was as true in the 13th century as it was before 1971, though in the Middle Ages the pennies went a good deal further. In Edward I's day, an unskilled labourer could earn 1 or 2 pence for a day's work, while a skilled craftsman might earn double that sum. A man who took home £20 a year would have been considered very well off, and even the greatest individuals in English society, the earls, rarely enjoyed incomes in excess of £5,000. Only Edward himself had a 5-figure income, receiving around £27,000 a year from ordinary royal revenues, which he spent running his household, and by extension, the kingdom as a whole. Carnarvon Castle, although never completed, ended up costing roughly the same amount. The only type of coin in widespread circulation was the silver penny, so a pound was a weighty bag of coins, and even a small-sounding sum like £5 had to be counted out as 1,200 silver pennies. Money was also reckoned in marks, which were equivalent to 160 pennies, or 2/3 of a pound. 1. A saint in name. This story begins in the year 1239 with a girl called Eleanor. Eleanor lives in England, a peaceful and prosperous kingdom, much the same size then as it is now. Eleanor herself, however, is not English. She was bred and brought up in Provence, an independent county in the south of what is now modern France. The reason Eleanor is living in England in 1239 is because 3.5 years earlier she had been married to the King of England, Henry III. At the time of their wedding, Henry was 28. Eleanor was 12. Eleanor is now 16 years old, or very nearly so, and reportedly a great beauty, graceful, charming, and elegant. Henry is very much in love with her, and she with him, but she has yet to win the hearts of his subjects. In the 13th century, the English did not take to foreigners with the same easy readiness they do today. We may take as our witness a monk of St. Albans by the name of Matthew Paris, who, as well as being a thoroughgoing xenophobe, also happens to be one of the most gossipy, prolific, and best-informed chroniclers of the entire Middle Ages. Brother Matthew and his contemporaries had observed the effects of Eleanor's arrival and seen the thing they most feared: an influx of foreigners surrounding their king, separating him from his natural subjects, and advising him, so the English believed, badly. Rather ridiculously, Paris tried to pin the blame for this on Eleanor. Foreigners were pulling the kingdom to pieces, he said, and Henry, being under the influence of his wife, was letting them. It was also apparently held against Eleanor that 3 years into her marriage she had not produced any children. It was feared the Queen was barren, said Matthew Paris, with the sympathy of a professional celibate. Again, this was quite ridiculous, given Eleanor's tender years. What is much more likely is that Henry III, a kind and considerate man, had been exercising a bit of self-restraint. 12 was the minimum age at which the medieval church would permit girls to marry, and Henry and Eleanor had probably had sex soon after their wedding. But this would have been for political reasons, to ensure that their union was valid and binding. Common sense and compassion suggested that 12 was too young for regular marital relations, and to run the risk that Eleanor might become pregnant. By the time Matthew Paris made this comment, however, Eleanor was 15, Henry was 31, and they were definitely sleeping together. We know this because on the 9th of September 1238, in the middle of the night, a knife-wielding madman broke into Henry's bedchamber with the intention of killing the king. He failed because, as Matthew Paris himself tells us, Henry was not in his room at the time. Luckily, he was with the Queen. And now, a little over 9 months on from that dramatic evening, the Queen is about to confound her critics and silence the rumour-mongers. It is June 1239, just a few days short of midsummer, and Eleanor is lodged in Henry's palace at Westminster, by the side of the River Thames, on the site where the modern Houses of Parliament stand. And there, during the night of the 17th to 18th of June, in a room presumably lit by lanterns and candles, she gives birth to her first child. Her delivery is successful, the baby is healthy, and, best of all, it is a boy. In the most important aspect of her role as queen, Eleanor has triumphed. She has provided Henry and England with an heir to the throne. There was an immediate celebration in the Palace of Westminster. At Henry's command, the clerks of the royal chapel sang the triumphant anthem Christus Vincit, Christus Regnat, Christus Imperat, Christ conquers, Christ reigns, Christ rules, and messengers were sent speeding off in all directions to spread the good news. In nearby London, a walled city of some 50,000 souls, the citizens went wild, dancing through the streets with lanterns, drums, and tambourines. Soon the royal messengers were returning, laden with costly gifts from the king's greatest subjects. In some cases, Henry apparently felt that these presents were not costly enough, and sent their bearers back to get better ones. According to Matthew Paris, this provoked some wag at court to quip, "God has given us this child, but the king is selling him to us." Paris himself, striking a more serious tone, thought that Henry's ingratitude had deeply clouded his magnificence, and the episode, while not very significant, does provide something of a character note for the king. Henry, as other contemporaries observed, was a ver simplex, charitably a straightforward chap, more obviously a simpleton. Consequently, he tended to act in inept ways such as this. Even when fortune handed him a silk purse, Henry could generally be relied upon to make a pig's ear out of it. A much more important indicator of the king's personality is provided by the name he chose for his newborn son. Henry, although King of England, was ancestrally and culturally French. He and his family were direct descendants of William the Conqueror, the Norman duke who had snatched England's throne some 170 years earlier. Similarly, his leading subjects were all directly descended from the Conqueror's Norman companions. When they talked to each other, they spoke French, or at least a slightly anglicised Norman version of it, and when they came to christen their children, they gave them French names. William, Guillaume, for example, was still a popular name, for obvious reasons. So too was Richard, Ricard, because it evoked the memory of Henry's famous uncle, Richard the Lionheart. And Henry, Henri, itself was perfectly respectable and commonplace. Henry III might have been rather limited in his abilities, but his two namesake predecessors had both been fearsome and successful warrior kings, worthy of commemoration and emulation. All these options, however, Henry rejected. He had no desire to father conquerors, or for that matter, crusaders. Thanks to his own father, the notorious King John, he had grown up surrounded by uncertainty and conflict. John had died in the midst of a self-inflicted civil war, bequeathing to his son a kingdom scarred and divided. What Henry craved above all for himself and his subjects was peace, harmony, and stability. And it was a reflection of this ambition that he decided to call his son Edward. Edward was a deeply unfashionable name in 1239. No king or nobleman had been lumbered with it since the Norman conquest, because it belonged to the side that had lost. Edward was an Old English name, and it sounded as odd and outlandish to Norman ears after 1066 as other Old English names. Egbert, Ethelred, Egfrith still sound to us today. To call a boy such a name after the conquest was to invite ridicule. He was bound to be mocked by the Williams, Richards and Henrys, who were his peers. But Henry III had good reason for foisting this unfashionable name on his firstborn son. After his father's death, his mother had abandoned him. Isabella of Angoulême left England for her homeland in France, remarried, and never returned. Effectively orphaned from the age of 9, the young king had found substitute father figures among the elderly men who had helped him govern his kingdom. But these men, too, Henry ultimately decided, had failed him, and by 1234 he found himself alone once more. It was at this point, though, that the king discovered a new mentor, a man who would never ever let him down, largely because he had already been dead for the best part of 2 centuries. Henry's new patron was Edward the Confessor, the penultimate king of Anglo-Saxon England. Like Henry himself, Edward had not been a very successful ruler. His death in January 1066 had sparked the succession crisis that led to the Norman conquest 9 months later. Posthumously, however, Edward had acquired a reputation as a man of great goodness, so much so that a century after his death he had been officially recognized as a saint. Thereafter his reign had acquired the retrospective glow of a golden age. Men spoke with great reverence about his good and just laws, even though in reality he never made any. Of course, the fact that Edward was not a great warrior had made him an unlikely exemplar for the conquering dynasty of kings who came after him. But to a man like Henry III, who was entirely lacking in military skill, the Confessor seemed the perfect role model. There were, moreover, other similarities between their 2 lives that must have struck Henry as highly significant. Edward had lost his father and been abandoned by his mother at a young age. He had grown up with war and wished to cultivate peace. He had been misled by treacherous ministers. Above all, Edward, like Henry, was famed for his piety. Edward was the king who established the royal palace at Westminster in order to be near the great abbey, Minster, that he spent the last years of his life rebuilding. In due course he was buried in the abbey church, and his tomb there became a pilgrim shrine. It was the greatest testament to Henry III's love and reverence for the Confessor that from 1245 he would spend vast sums rebuilding the abbey for a second time, replacing the old Romanesque church with the massive Gothic building that stands today. It was no surprise to anyone, therefore, that Henry should choose to call his son Edward in honour of his idol. Nor, probably, was it a coincidence that the boy happened to be born in Westminster. Henry spent plenty of time in his palace there, partly to be near the abbey, and partly because Westminster was a centre for some branches of royal government. But the king had lots of other palaces and castles all over England, and to govern his realm properly he was obliged to travel around them. It seems likely that Henry had deliberately arranged it so that he and Eleanor were in Westminster as the end of her term approached, so that they would be in the closest possible proximity to the Confessor's shrine. Being born in Westminster also meant that Edward could be baptized there. A few days after his birth, the new baby became the first king of England to be christened in the abbey, surrounded by a great crowd of bishops, noblemen, and ladies, no fewer than 12 of whom became his godparents. Henry was evidently determined from the first that his son would have all the affection and guidance in childhood that he himself had lacked. Westminster's spiritual and governmental advantages made it a busy place, unsuitable for the raising of children. A few weeks after Edward's birth, the court left the palace and travelled 50 miles up the Thames, 20 miles as the crow flies, to the royal castle at Windsor. It was here, in the quiet Berkshire countryside, that Henry and Eleanor intended their son should grow up. Soon after their wedding in 1236, Henry had begun a major rebuilding program to update the venerable fortress. Windsor had been established by William the Conqueror, in line with contemporary standards of luxury and his own exacting tastes. A brand new chamber had already been constructed for the Queen, and just a few weeks after his birth, work began on an adjacent courtyard for her son. Henry went on to build a wholly new suite of rooms at Windsor for himself and Eleanor, with an especially grand chapel. Altogether, the king spent well over £10,000 on these improvements, enough to have built an entirely new castle from scratch. Almost nothing of these buildings survives today. The fragments that remain, however, such as the doors to the chapel and the detailed orders that Henry sent to his designers, are enough to establish the quality of the life that they afforded. Chambers were fashioned expensively in stone, with fireplaces and ensuite toilets. They were linked by covered walkways and lit by large windows, glazed with glass of many colours. Interior decor was sumptuous. Floors were exquisitely tiled. Pillars were sculpted from Purbeck marble. Walls were painted with colourful patterns or hung with tapestries. Henry's favourite decorative scheme, it seems, was for green walls spangled with gold stars. Outside, in the courtyards, gardens were planted with herbs and flowers. Nor was this level of luxury confined to Windsor. At all his palaces and castles, even ones he hardly ever visited, Henry delighted in commissioning new building work, improving the plumbing or the wainscoting, or ordering new wall paintings. Favourite subject, Edward the Confessor. It made him something of a target for satirical comment. "White bread, chambers, and tapestries," mocked one observer. "To ride like a dean on a docile mount. The king likes better all that than to put on a coat of mail." But it also meant that Henry and his young family enjoyed a level of comfort that is the antithesis of what most people today imagine as medieval. Even as a small child, Edward ate off silver plate and drank fine wine imported from the south of France. By his parents' command, he was dressed in expensive silks, robes of scarlet trimmed with fur, and cloth of gold. As the orders for these items imply, Henry was an attentive and doting father, and his itinerary suggests that he spent as much time as he could at Windsor. Nevertheless, the fact that such orders had to be committed to writing indicates that for most of the time the business of government meant that the king had to be elsewhere. So too, on some occasions, did Eleanor, her most notable absence being a 17-month visit to France with Henry in 1242 to 1243. In general, however, the Queen was at Windsor far more often than her husband. Such evidence as survives suggests that she probably resided at the castle for well over half of all the weeks in any one year. This was, without doubt, because she wanted to spend as much time as possible with her growing brood of children. In the autumn of 1240, Edward had been joined at Windsor by a little sister, delivered at the castle on the 29th of September, and christened Margaret in honour of a maternal aunt. A few years later, in 1243, came Beatrice, born in Bordeaux during her parents' trip to France, and named, in this instance, after Eleanor's mother. When a second son arrived at the start of 1245, it was Henry's turn to do the naming. And once again, he defied convention in order to honour another Old English royal saint. Baby Edmund was soon installed in what had become a veritable royal nursery. As well as his younger siblings, Edward by this stage was keeping company with his cousin Henry and a number of other noble children. Needless to say, the Queen had plenty of help in raising them all. Her foremost assistants were Hugh and Sybil Gifford, a husband and wife team who were entrusted with Edward's custody from the moment of his birth. Sybil, indeed, had helped to deliver Edward, and was later well rewarded by Henry for having acted as midwife. There were also several other ladies on hand to assist in the practicalities of child-raising. As an infant, Edward had two nurses, Alice and Sarah, whose responsibilities would have extended to suckling him. Eleanor was also supported, in a less immediate but nevertheless crucially important way, by certain members of her own family. On her mother's side, the Queen had no fewer than 6 clever and ambitious uncles. These men, who hailed from the Alpine province of Savoy, saw in their niece's marriage the opportunity for self-advancement, and she in return looked to them for help and advice. One of these uncles, William of Savoy, had...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?